It's kind of difficult to begin this presentation now because of all the wonderful things that were said. I don't want to spoil people's opinion of me. What I'm going to do is start going through some material. The richest theology in the Catholic Church is around the Eucharist, everything. And again, as I told you, the most significant theologian massively in the church so far has been Thomas Aquinas, and it's largely because he focused everything on the Eucharist. Thomas says that the Eucharist, in fact, this in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, is the Alpha and the Omega of all sacraments. The purpose of your baptism is so that you can receive Eucharist. The purpose of confirmation is so you can invite others to the Eucharist. The purpose of reconciliation is so that you can get back to the Eucharist after you sin. The purpose of marriage is to produce people to receive the Eucharist. I could go through it endlessly, but Thomas Aquinas sees everything in reference to the Eucharist. First thing I'd like to do is start off with symbolism. There's a huge amount of symbolism in the Eucharist in all kinds of ways, but I'd like to start out with the elements, with bread and wine, okay? Understand that bread, wheat bread, and wine were not eaten in the days of Jesus. Only wealthy people ever ate that. Poor people ate a bread that was made from barley, and they also drank water, okay? So they had barley bread and water. The only time they would ever encounter wheat bread and wine would be at a wedding or at Passover. That would be it, okay? So understand that in a very special way, the church uses this bread and wine to remind us that we're participating in a banquet that we will be part of in the future. But today you and I get a taste of bread and a taste of the wine. But ultimately, that will be the banquet forever. But not yet. Not yet. There's just the taste, and we get these tastes. But it's the taste of a whole nother level for a Jew. In their tradition, it's a taste of a whole nother level. The second thing has to do with the unity. When you look at the Eucharist, one of the things that's unique about bread and wine, in both cases, there is the element that you and I contribute to it. You know, planting the seeds, taking the harvest, grinding the grain. Planting the seeds, taking the grapes, and then crushing the grapes. But also, there's something that the element does itself. So remember, it grows in the ground with the water. We can't make it grow. It grows in the ground. And then ultimately, once you create grape juice, you have to wait and let it become wine. You can't create wine. You create grape juice and leave it alone for a while, and it'll create wine. The same thing with the wheat and water. You put it together, you leave it for a while, and it becomes bread. You don't just make it. It has to be sat a while, even in the water and the flour, that it becomes something. And in both cases, they're symbols of unity. When I was a little boy, I was taught, I had a very good preparation for First Communion, but I was taught that when we were to go up to receive communion, that what we did was receive Jesus Christ within ourselves. And then we would go back to our pew and, sit down and sort of commune with the Jesus within us. That's not really the image of the Eucharist. The fact of the matter is, we believe the Eucharist is the only food that consumes the eater. So when you receive the Eucharist, Jesus is not inside you. You are inside Jesus. You realize if Jesus were inside each one of us, that would not create unity. That would divide Jesus. But if you and I are within Jesus, that creates unity because we're united within Jesus. So in the Eucharist, you and I are consumed by Jesus. And this idea of being in his presence and speaking to him and everything is all a wonderful thing. But it's because we're in Jesus, not because Jesus is in us. We actually are put in this unity. And there's all kinds of symbolisms. I remember I was at a dinner, and a man there had decided he wanted to leave the Catholic Church. And he said that he gave the reasons why he was leaving it and everything. And I think he expected a reaction from me. But, you know, nothing I like less than a food fight. So as we're going through the thing he was talking about, the thing leaving the church, and I said, you know that there's a ceremony, a basic thing you can do to alienate yourself from the Catholic Church. It is a very specific thing you can apply for from the church, and basically you've cut off your thing from the Catholic Church. But we in the Catholic Church recognize that as a legal thing, so that, you know, someone who wants to become a Buddhist or something feels free to do this, and you want to give them the freedom, this sort of thing. But basically we believe once a Catholic, always a Catholic. And he says, well, I don't know about that at all. I said, do you know the basic symbols of the unity in the Catholic Church? And he gave a couple things. I said, the basic symbols are bread and wine. Those are the symbols of the unity of the church. I said, pick up your glass of wine. And so I picked it up. I said, do you know how easy it would be for you to leave the church? You pick a single grape out of that cup. Pick up a loaf of bread. You pick a single grain of wheat out of it. Then you can get out of it. But that's not true. You and I have been malumated into Christ Jesus. And we are there in that unity. It is a powerful and complete unity. And it's found in simply the bread and wine. Another thing is, after scene, after scene, after scene, but they don't relate to one another. They're just the next thing they remember and they put it together. Matthew is very different. When Matthew's account is written, what they're most interested in is prophecy. So, like Jesus will do something, Mark's gospel, but when he does it in Matthew, they'll say, according to the prophets, as was written in the text. Matthew, and that's because it's a Jewish community. They were looking for the Messiah. They had the prophecies. That's what they watched. So they put that together in Matthew. The next one that was produced was Luke. And Luke wasn't an apostle. In fact, Luke appears to be a pagan. He was in Damascus, and he was a convert. And he headed the community in Damascus. And Damascus was the last one to produce an account. And Luke fancies himself a historian, a Greek-type historian. And he takes the events of Mark and he puts them historically. So they flow like a story, okay? But they put theirs together when they realized the last one died. And the last place this happened was the city of Ephesus in modern-day Turkey. But at that time in history, that was part of Greece. And in that city is where the Apostle John stayed. And the Apostle John became bishop there. And that was the last account written. And that account, we say, is truly a Catholic account. Mark is sort of a slideshow. Matthew is Jewish. Luke is Gentile. But by the time John's was put together, which is maybe 100 years after the death of Jesus, but the time John's was put together, we were truly a Catholic community, no longer Jewish or Greek. We were in fact Catholic. So it's a very Catholic gospel. And that's why a good percentage of John's gospel takes place at the Last Supper. Almost 2 chapters of John's gospel are about the Last Supper. Why? The Last Supper is the Eucharist. That's the whole thing. In a Catholic situation, that is the thing of it. So the name on a gospel was in fact the name of the person who'd been the bishop, not really the author, but the person who probably told many of the stories and the person who invited people to tell the stories. This over a period of time, these texts then were all composed by the liturgy, and they were posed by the Catholic community. They were put together by the Catholic community at the liturgy. In a very true sense, the author of the Christian scriptures is the Eucharist. The Eucharist is, in fact, the author. There's no one name you could put on it. It was put together in this gathering that we call the Eucharistic community. The next thing is that in the Jewish tradition, there were thousands of sacrifices. If your wife became pregnant, there was a sacrifice. If your wife was delivered of a child safely, there was a sacrifice. If someone died, there was a sacrifice. If someone was sick, there was a sacrifice for healing. If someone sinned, there was a sacrifice for sin. If you're petitioning God for something, there was a sacrifice for petition. One of the basic things the rabbis said, that when the Messiah finally comes, all sacrifices in the temple will disappear except one. Only one sacrifice in the temple will continue. And that actually is the sacrifice of thanksgiving, because you will actually run out of things to ask God for, but you will never run out of things to be thankful for. So finally, that sacrifice of thanksgiving will continue for all eternity. And you may or may not know this, but one time I was in Greece, and I presumed it was the Feast of Corpus Christi. Everywhere there were huge banners that had the word Eucharist across them. And it was in the shops. You'd see the Eucharist all over. But Eucharist is the Greek word for thanksgiving. And it was their Thanksgiving Day they were celebrating. So for them, they'd put it all up. But I had forgotten that the word Eucharist actually means thanksgiving. So the only sacrifice that should be left after the Messiah comes is actually the sacrifice we have, which is the sacrifice of thanksgiving. The commemoration that takes place in the sacrifice of thanksgiving, first of all, there's a commemoration of the death of Jesus. And where is the death of Jesus commemorated? The death of Jesus is commemorated in the consecration of bread and wine. Whenever your body and your blood are separated, you're dead. So we consecrate the body and the blood separately. And we do that in order to commemorate the death of Jesus Christ. How do we commemorate the resurrection? We commemorate the resurrection by the reception of communion, because in the reception, the wine and the bread are united. And so the resurrection of Jesus is commemorated within us. Now, ever since the beginning of the church, I think you know the beginning of the church, everyone received the consecrated wine, and then that sort of fell into disuse. But even when it was in disuse, and like when I entered the seminary, there was no communion under two species at all. But when I entered in the seminary, it was not a valid Mass if the priest did not receive a host consecrated at that Mass. Like if you could take hosts out of the tabernacle to distribute to people, but the priest couldn't receive one of them. He had to receive a host from that Mass and had to receive from the cup, so that the resurrection was commemorated. Now, we know that because who Jesus is, the body and blood can be received simply in the consecrated wine, as we will sometimes communicate people who are sick that way, who can't take solids. And we do know that the body and blood are both present in the host. But the symbolism is the separation of the body and blood, and then the union of the body and blood. And I find one of the most powerful things about the Eucharist is to understand that when you come forward to receive communion, in the reception of communion, you're proclaiming the resurrection. That in a real sense, the resurrection happens at that moment in you, that Jesus rises again. And that this resurrection is done. Once the resurrection is commemorated, then the liturgy ends with you and I to carry that out to the world. So that's what we're supposed to be doing. And so we've commemorated the death and commemorated the resurrection. In Jesus, we oftentimes find this argument about is Jesus' body and blood a commemoration, or is in fact the body and blood of Jesus? And that's a big thing in the Protestant community. Many of the Protestant communities will say it's a commemoration. I think you know during the Last Supper, Jesus will say, do this in memory of me. And commemoration is done in memory. And Paul will be very clear about in the Eucharist, we commemorate the death and resurrection of Jesus. Paul's used, but understand the Eucharist, if you ever end up in a discussion like that, the Eucharist is both a commemoration and in fact is Jesus. So that it is a commemoration of the death and resurrection, but it is in fact Jesus. I always use the idea of Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving is a commemoration of the meal with the pilgrims, but we eat turkey, okay? So the turkey is how we commemorate the thing with the thing. Well, with Jesus, we commemorate his death and resurrection, but anyone who says it's not a commemoration is wrong. It is a commemoration of the death and resurrection of Jesus, and most Protestants teach that powerfully. The curious thing is that originally, if you watch the churches that broke off, one of the most powerful things in Luther, when he broke off, Luther, you may or may not know this, was a Mariologist. Luther is one of the most powerful writings on Mary that we have in the church, are by Luther himself. And Luther was very strong on the Eucharist. And Eucharist was extremely strong in the early Protestant communities as they broke off. Today, you'd find out there are very, very few in the Protestant community that hold that the Eucharist is the body and blood of Jesus. They hold it's the commemoration. But I'd like you to look at the Protestant church as it is. It's really a community of churches. And I have a very good friend of mine who's a Presbyterian minister, and she's really good. She's been a Presbyterian minister her whole life and teaches and all this stuff. But one of the things that she decided to go back and wanted a degree in church history. So she went back and got the specific degree in American church history. And she went, of course, to a Protestant college. And she came back, and the first thing she said to me when she got back, she said, "We never should have left the Catholic Church." The day we left the Catholic Church, we kept breaking into more and more and more denominations until today. Do you know that most Protestant churches are their own denomination? You know, these mega churches and stuff, you don't find lots of Lutherans. You find these big mega churches. You don't, and for my money, that's the loss of the Eucharist. The Eucharist is the unity. You know, we talk about the symbolism and everything, but all we're talking about is what we can see. What we can see in a sacrament is just a sign and a symbol of what's actually going on. We are bound together by the Eucharist. And to the degree we lose the belief in the reality of Jesus in the Eucharist, we threaten the very unity of the church itself. And if you watch historically, those who abandon it disintegrate as churches. And if I could say for a simple thing, if Satan could do one thing to the Roman Catholic Church, he would ask them to get rid of belief in the real presence. Because when we do, that will be our path. That gradually it disintegrates. And the great power of Satan is to divide and conquer. So we have to hold powerfully to this. And again, today it's a time in which I think the thought is threatened. And we want to be people who, in the church, really promote the Eucharist. I had a professor in the seminary from Germany. Actually, he was from Austria, but a wonderful story. he, I don't know if you know this, but Hitler drafted almost all the seminarians when he got in power. And he wanted them all in the SS. And the reason he wanted them in the SS, he said, these are the people most likely to keep an oath. If you can get them to take the oath, they will keep it. And so this gentleman, in order to preserve his life, went into as a seminarian, went into the SS, and he was put in charge of fuel distribution in France, in a section, farmers. And he was very open about the practice of his faith. He used to go to Mass every day in the local church, and would sing in the choir and stuff like that. Anyway, one midnight Mass, because of his duties, he was very late when he got to church. So unfortunately, actually fortunately, but he arrived at the church in his SS uniform to sing in the choir at midnight Mass, and someone photographed him. And about 3 weeks later, he was arrested and he was sent to Dachau. I think you know Dachau is where they put the German prisoners. So he was sent to Dachau. And he arrived there 1 month before Dachau was liberated, which meant that when the Russians came in and liberated it, he was liberated as a prisoner, not liberated as an SS member, in which case he'd have been shot dead on the spot. So it saved his life, ultimately. But anyway, he became a priest, and in the thing when he was in his village, every time the Germans came looking for fuel, he'd tell all the farmers, and they'd bury all their fuel. And then the Germans would go through and this sort of thing. But anyway, he had some problems with the language, but the problems with the language were very, very informative to me. One of the problems with the language, he always referred to the Eucharist as he. It was never, will you get it out of the tabernacle? Would you bring it to me? It was always he. Would you get him out of the tabernacle? Would you bring him to me? And I've often tried to follow that in my own way and think about it, because it enforces the fact that this is a person, the Eucharist. This is the body and blood of Jesus. Another one he had confused was belief and know. So he would look out the window, see the sun rising, and he'd say, I believe the sun is rising, but I know there is a God. And this whole idea that what we believe is actually stronger than what we know. And to hold to that, to realize it is the stronger reality. The stronger reality is what we believe. And if you look carefully in your life, and this is true of everyone, you only know the things you perceive while trying to learn what you believe. So if I believe we could have electricity, Edison said that, okay? All right, once you believe it, you pursue it, and oftentimes you find it. But belief is much stronger in anyone than is knowledge. We think of knowledge as a solid thing. Knowledge is the child of belief, works the other way around. The other thing I'd like to say about the Eucharist is that the Eucharist is transforming. And when I say the Eucharist is transforming, I'm not talking about the bread and wine, which are definitely transformed. But just before Vatican II, a very interesting thing went on. The man who was head of what's called the Holy Office was a man by the name of Ottaviani, a very elderly cardinal and the classic conservative. And John the 23rd was Pope. So John the 23rd put together the council, but by the structure of the church, Ottaviani was in charge of it. And so Ottaviani, being in charge of the council, he set it up in such a way that it would enforce the things that he was about. And because he was in the Holy Office, which governs liturgy as well, he wrote a letter, and the letter he wrote was that no word in the Eucharistic prayer could be changed in any way at all. Now, he was talking about the Latin Eucharistic prayer, okay, called the canon. He was talking about the Latin canon. And not changed at all would mean it couldn't even be changed language-wise, okay? But no, nothing could be changed. And I'm thinking, as a student, we didn't want to change anything except the language. It never occurred to us that we would end up with a liturgy like this. I would be regarded as a liberal, and I didn't even hope for something like this. We hoped it would be in English so we could understand it, or personally, so I could stop studying Latin, okay? But this is what we hoped for. And so it seemed to me that that's hardly a very conservative position anyway. John the 23rd then added a name to the Eucharistic prayer, and he added the name Joseph. Joseph's name was never in the Eucharistic prayer before John the 23rd. He added it in the Latin. And John the 23rd was supposed to be some raging liberal. I'm thinking, what's so liberal about St. Joseph? I mean, for God's sake, where could you find a more conservative edition? But you know what I didn't know? The two of the gentlemen were fighting over the altar. Because I'll tell you a secret about the Roman Catholic Church. Whoever's in charge of the altar is in charge of the church. It doesn't matter what your office is. If you're in charge of the altar, we have a saying in theology, as the church prays, so she believes. Belief follows prayer. It's kind of like in the United States. Just to say one thing on it, in the United States, our laws follow practice. They don't create the way we live. They tried once in this country to create the way we live by a law. They called it prohibition. And it was even a constitutional amendment. It was in the Constitution that alcohol was prohibited. But that didn't work. On the other hand, you can educate people, and if people change, laws will change. An example is, through education, we've eliminated smoking. Smoking is a very rare thing. Do you know in the town I live, San Luis Obispo, it is against the law to smoke on the streets downtown. You can't smoke on the streets downtown. And they did that by education. If you can turn people against smoking, you'll end up with a law. But a law will not turn people against smoking. The reason why I'm mentioning this, I'm very opposed to creating a law against abortion. I'm very much in favor of educating what abortion does to a woman who has one, because that's how we did the smoking. We educated, they did a lot of, it started when I was a little boy by a community known as the Tuberculosis Society, and they started it. And they did a lot of work, and they found out the one thing that appeals to women, looks. So they showed these grizzled old women with a cigarette sticking out of their mouth and all this sort of thing. It worked. Then they found out what worked on men. It can cause impotency. Oh, there were cigarettes put out all over the world, you know, just like that. But what they did was, first of all, work. It took them a long time to figure out what is wrong with this. Now, there's lots of things wrong with smoking, and trust me, there's lots of things wrong with abortion. But you have to find the thing that appeals to the person who's going to be smoking or the person who's going to have the abortion. That's what you have to find out. And when you change the community attitude, law will always follow. But it's erroneous in the United States to think laws change conduct, you know? I think of when I'm driving down the road and 65 miles an hour and suddenly it drops to 45. Do I slow to 45? I start to look for policemen. That's what I do, okay? And I think, you know, you have to know that we need to learn to change attitudes. And so what happened was, in our church, this is always controlled by who was ever in charge of the altar. And it turned out to be John the 23rd. He took control of the altar by adding the thing. One of the very first things that Octaviani did was, at the first meeting, The most liberal theologian there was a man by the name of Yves Congar, a very, very brilliant French theologian. But he was the most liberal, and a lot of his teachings were condemned in many dioceses. But John the 23rd recognized his expertise, and he was there. He was what is called a paridi. And a paridi at the Vatican Council had no right to speak. But a paridi was a consultant that any bishop could use. So like, for instance, suppose they're going to do something on the Eucharist, and I don't know anything about the Eucharist. Well, several of the paridi, Eucharist was their field. So you'd go and get the information you needed in order to deal with it at the thing. So anyway, he was a paridi. And he kept notes, a diary. In the Catholic Church, if you keep notes on something like that, they cannot be published till 50 years after your death. And so his notes were published about 7 years ago. But it's very interesting. At the first meeting, he's taking his notes, and Ottaviani opens the meeting, and he says, now I've passed around papers so you can check the names of the bishops you want on the different committees dealing with the different aspects of the liturgy and everything. And he says it's important that a member of the Holy Law Office be on each committee. So he said, what I've done is on the list, I put all the names of the members of the Holy Office in capital letters and all the other names in lower letters. And so the natural thing is people will be checking off the capital letters. And Congar writes in his notes, it's over and it hasn't started. He goes through all this. And then the next thing that happens, every bishop had the right to speak. So this Brazilian bishop, who Congar maintains was old enough to have been God's godfather, came forward. He had to be helped up the steps. And he's thinking, oh no. And this guy, you'd think he was from California actually, but this guy got up and he said, I don't think we should fill out the list till we get to know one another. So I would suggest in the coming week, the different groups of bishops hold cocktail parties in their respective thing so that we can go as a group to meet the American bishops or as a group to meet the German bishops. A party bishop, it's exactly what they needed. So he sets this whole thing up. And you know what Congar's in the margin of his notes there? Christus vincit, Jesus has won. And that's exactly what went on. They got to know one another and put it all together. But it's this power of the Eucharist, that once the control of the Eucharist was under John's, it was going to work out. It had to, and that's because the way this goes on. And to give you a very personal thing, I have, and I'm sure I've mentioned this before, I have probably the most serious case of dyslexia you would find outside of a mental institution. I've had several doctors I've dealt with say you are this close to being institutionalized with regards to the dyslexia. I could not read going through school and had very, very poor grades and all this stuff going through. And as a result of that, you become extremely shy because whenever they call on you, you prove yourself to be an idiot. So you say nothing and you sit in the back and all this sort of thing. Now that's exactly what I was as a child. The first thing I ever did publicly in my life was when the pastor asked me to carry the small infant into the church to the midnight mass on Christmas. It's the first thing I ever did publicly. The first thing I ever spoke publicly was actually in Latin, was when I served mass, the thing. And I can watch my whole life from that little kid who was terrified to do anything to who I am today took place at that altar. The whole thing took place in stages at that altar. And that altar has the ability, it has been transforming our church for 2,000 years. And it invites every one of us to a constant transformation. Pay attention to the homilies. You'll always find you're doing something wrong. You remember that was one of the blessings of Paul. If you had lived in the first century Christianity, the last thing you'd want to find in your mailbox was a letter from Paul, okay? Because something was very wrong. But that's the nature, you know, I oftentimes think of, I worked in a restaurant when I was first, as a student working in the summers. And we had a large steam table. And in the steam table, there were plates on a spring. And these plates would come up, and there are about 2 plates at the top, and you take them off, and, you know, 2 more come up, and they keep being hot that way. And I've come to think of my spiritual life as that. Whenever I look at what's wrong in my life, I see only 2 things, and I can handle them. But once they're gone, there seem to be 2 more sitting there. And I think that's the way God handles the church. That He pulls it on little by little, little by little, little by little. But that transformation takes place here at the altar. I guess to tell you another story along that way, and this just happened recently in San Luis Obispo, where I am. A man moved into town, and he had been in the class ahead of me in the seminary, had become a priest, and had left the priesthood. And he was married and had a family, and so he was in the parish. And I hadn't seen him for 58 years. And he said, would you go out to breakfast with me? I said, sure, okay. So I never turned down a mimosa. So we went out to breakfast, and while we were at breakfast, he pulled out of his pocket a paper that for all the world looked like a biblical manuscript. You know, you opened it up, it almost cracked and this sort of thing. He says, do you remember this? I said, no. He said, that's the first sermon you gave in the seminary. When we went into the seminary, every student had to give a talk one day in the year, which was a meditation at night. And you know, you gave it, and the talk was maybe a half hour or something like that. But after the talk, he told me, I didn't remember any of this. He said, after the talk, I asked you for the notes, and you handed them to me. They're just about, as a dyslexic, you don't use notes much because you can't read, okay? So you use a note maybe to get an idea, but you can't just read through the notes. And so he asked for them. But they assigned you a text, and the text I was assigned was Young Men See Visions, Old Men Dream Dreams. And so what I talked about was a vision is a look at the future, and young men are full of plans for the future. And dreams I used in terms of daydreams. As you get older, you begin to think about the wonderful things you did and the things you've accomplished and that sort of thing. And I said, it isn't that old men dream dreams, it's that dreamers are old men. It isn't young men see vision, but visionaries are young men. If you spend your whole life looking at the future as a visionary, you will never get old. That's what makes a person old, is to turn to the past rather than the future. And so he says, you know, I read this every day. And it's just a few notes. I read it every day. The first talk I ever gave, and I got in trouble with the faculty because my half-hour talk was 7 minutes. Okay? I have been through my whole life always corrected because you talk too little, you don't talk long enough. And I have never been able to convince most priests. People like short sermons. Okay? So if it's good, it's wonderful. If it's bad, at least it's over. Short sermons are good, you know? So short sermons on their own. But as a result, the dyslexia forbid the notes. I see things like that work so much against me, ultimately turned out to be in my favor. And all this thing. And it's like I look at the package at the beginning, and you look at what could possibly be done with that. He's too shy, he's too this, he can't, that sort of thing. And the thing is, God says, I know exactly what I could do. Give him communion, okay? And I believe that's exactly what happened. God drew me forward, and I am the result of a disaster with communion. That's, it's just that simple. And I see the power of that. I'd tell you a little bit about Teilhard de Chardin, and we'll stop there. But Teilhard de Chardin is an evolutionist and taught, paleontologist. He taught and studied evolution and everything. But one of the things that he teaches is, you have to understand that Chardin went for very long periods of his life without being able to say Mass as a priest. And one of the reasons is, up until probably the mid-40s, maybe the late 40s, up until that time, a priest could not say Mass unless there was another Catholic present. That the Mass is not a private devotion, okay? So you must have someone else present. And if you didn't have someone to serve, well, Teilhard de Chardin, because of his teachings on evolution, he scared the French bishops to death. And the French bishops were able to persuade the Jesuits to get rid of him. So the Jesuits transferred him as a missionary to China. And Teilhard de Chardin remains to this day the only Jesuit in all of the history of the Jesuits who was sent to a mission without being taught the language. So he got there because they didn't want him to talk to anyone anyway. So he went there. So he spent all this time working with paleontologists. When he arrived in China, realizing he's being punished and everything, and so he's thinking about this thing of what's he supposed to do. And the very first day he goes out on a dig, he finds, which was at that time the oldest humanoid fossil that was known. It was called the Peking Man. That fossil was destroyed during Japanese bombings of China. But he found that fossil. He saw that was God's confirmation. So he says, all right. He says, I'll stay with the paleontology. But he maintains that when we bring bread and wine to the altar, and it consecrated to bread and wine, he's into the body and blood of Jesus, he believes that consecration moves to the atomic level. I think you know that your being you is not on the atomic level. Your being you is on the molecular level. Now, molecules are made up of many different atoms, but those atoms could be reconstructed into anything else, okay? It's different once you get to molecules, but he believed that the consecration moved to the atomic level, down to the atoms. As a result of that, he says that the Eucharist, the molecules of the Eucharist, or the atoms of the Eucharist never cease to be Jesus, and they pass into the world through all of us. And that little by little through the Eucharist, God is transforming the universe into Jesus Christ. And every time you and I receive communion, a little piece of the world is absorbed, but it is permanent. And those atoms, whether they end up in trees or animals or plants or whatever, those atoms remain Jesus Christ. And he maintained in his life, when he would go out hiking and everything, he believed that he could look, and he says, I see almost tiny crystals in everything. And those crystals are the presence of Jesus gradually spreading over the whole world until, as the Bible says, one day he will be all in all. And it takes place through the power of the Eucharist. Okay? So I think that's probably too much for tonight, but we'll take a few minutes and see if anyone has any questions, answers, admonitions, or rebuttals. And then go on later. Anyone? Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
The last priest you mentioned,
Teilhard de Chardin.
What time period was he in?
He was born in France. There are two really important holy people from France at that time. One is Charles de Foucauld, and the other is Teilhard de Chardin. Both of them are up for canonization. Teilhard was a Jesuit. Charles de Foucauld founded his own religious community, the Little Company of Jesus. But Charles de Foucauld dedicated his life to the conversion of Muslims, and he worked largely in Morocco. And Teilhard de Chardin worked mainly in France and in China. Yeah. 1500s?
1500s?
Oh, no. Teilhard de Chardin died in 1950.
Oh, okay.
And I would say, Charles de Foucauld maybe even died after that. But they're both around the same time. But they're in that night. I put their deaths around 1950. They would be in that period. Yeah. Go ahead.
Father Jim, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago when the Pew Research folks did a survey of self-proclaimed Catholics. And I think it was almost 70% of those people claimed that they did not believe in the real presence. So a major failure in catechesis, as you said, as the source and sum of our faith.
Yeah.
You know, how do you have any thoughts on how we got there as a church? Ways forward to cure this?
I think sometimes when we deal with ecumenism, we homogenize. And the whole thing with ecumenism, I'm part of a strong ecumenical group, and it's headed by a Roman Catholic priest, a Presbyterian minister, an imam, and a rabbi. And we meet every 2 months, and we give a presentation. We take turns giving a presentation. But when you study another religion, the study of another religion should be a way of strengthening your faith. And you should look at the presentation of your religion as a way of strengthening the other's faith. Because ultimately, if that's what we're doing, we will all end up united in a single truth. And we know that truth is Jesus. Okay? So if you can invite them to the truth, and we work that way. Like for instance, there are a number of Buddhists in our group. And my whole process, in fact, out of the seminary, for me, meditation had been a rather esoteric process, that I would read a text and sit down and meditate on it and stuff like that. But when you begin to study in the Buddhist tradition, I think you know Buddha is sort of a Hindu Protestant, that he was a Hindu and broke off from the Hindus. So he's sort of a Hindu Protestant. But when he will sit in front of a tree, and he doesn't so much think in meditating, he wants to be absorbed within the tree and become a part of the universe, of this, that, the other thing. And it has greatly affected my meditation. Have I been tempted to become a Buddhist as a result of it? Not really. But it has really enriched my spiritual life with regards to meditation. And that's what we want to do with one another. You know, it's kind of like tumbling stones. If you've ever used a tumbler with regards to stones, you put a lot of, I was at Sri Lanka one time, and they got a bunch of stones we found in the rivers. I think you know the rivers there are full of precious stones, rubies, emeralds, all that kind of stuff. Not usually gem quality, but these things. And you put them all in the tumbler, and you tumble them, and they come out polished beautifully. But it's still a ruby. It hasn't ceased to be a ruby. The emerald hasn't ceased to be an emerald, but they're polished. And that's what we want to allow the world to do to us, and that's what we want to be about in the world. And I call that the quest for mutual comprehensibility. When someone explains to me what they believe as a Scientologist, I really want to know how someone can believe that. And I do that not by disputing it, but by listening to their explanation. And if someone were to ask me, why aren't you a Scientologist? I would say, I can tell you why I'm a Catholic, but I can't tell you why I'm not a Scientologist. You know, That we need to look at this very, very positively and understand that the God who speaks to me through the Eucharist and the Scriptures is the same God who speaks to any pagan who's sacrificing a chicken to a rock. You know, if you speak to the divine, we all know there's only one God up there. So I don't care what you call him. I don't care what your ceremony is. I don't care what books you write. I don't care what you're doing. If you're listening to God, you're listening to the same person I am. Call him anything you want. Okay? Go ahead.
I loved your talk about the Eucharist, but I can't write fast enough. So where can I find it?
He was writing fast enough. Look at his notes. I think this is probably all on tape. You could probably listen to it. I tell the kids today that one of the sad things about them and one of the great privileges of my life is that I made all my youthful mistakes before the internet. Theirs will live with them forever. However, having started teaching, they're all permanent. They're somewhere. But I think there's going to be tapes of this. Anyone else?
Are you going to speak about Melchizedek?
No, I could.
I mean, is that part of your plans, or just that whole?
I kind of open it according to questions and stuff and go on and prepare the next talk.
You want to talk about it? I guess
Sure.
I'm curious, 'cause all the way back in Genesis, we see bread and wine. And,
Yeah, sure.
or if you want to, I don't know.
No, that's a simple thing to do. Okay, anything else? Go ahead.
This is talking about the gospel that you read.
Mm-hmm.
And today I was having a conversation with a couple of people, three people, and I forgot, but I know if you would say, share with us, because I remember when we had a conversation, I said, a mustard seed doesn't have branches, it can't hold a bird,
Yeah,
you know, so you explained it one time, and I was trying to.
yeah. I think you know the mustard is a bush, and it grows larger in the Mideast than it does here, but birds don't nest in it. And I think the particular account here mentions that birds gather in it. It does, but Matthew says nest, but Mark says gather. And the fact of the matter is, if any of you ever buy wild seed to put out for birds to eat, you ever put that out, you'll notice they're little tiny spherical seeds that sort of a tan color. Those are mustard seeds, and they will be the dominant seed in almost any of these you get because they're the favorite seeds of birds. And if you're ever around mustard plants where they're in seed, they are covered with birds. And so that's what he's getting at, that the birds just cover those things, and it's because that's one of their favorite foods, that kind of seed. Fortunately, they haven't developed to the level where they put a hot dog under the mustard, but you know, it's a beginning. Okay, anything else? Okay, let's go ahead.
Piggybacking off of what Brother said over there, is I don't know if you'll be talking about it, but the relationship between the priest and the Eucharist with regards to Melchizedek and priest words in the Old Testament.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit. I'll go through a little bit of Melchizedek. That's a lengthy thing, but I'll do that as part of one of the talks. Go through who he is, where he comes from, that sort of thing. Okay, anything else? All right, we're out of here. You're going to divide into groups?